Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 1, Mass Communication, a Critical Approach. The core competencies for this class that we're going to cover in this lesson are how to be able to explain origins of the media industries, and we're just going to do a brief overview. We're going to dig deep in that throughout the semester. And also I'm going to introduce you to the concept of media convergence, which will be something you'll have to have a mastery understanding of by the end of the semester. For this specific lesson, by the end of the lesson, you should be able to understand what it means to be a media literate person. And you should know how culture and the history of mass communication are interrelated. You should be able to know what I mean when I talk about the cultural model for understanding mass communication. I usually call it the circuit of culture model, and we're going to dig into that. The book very briefly explains it. I'm going to go into that in much more detail because we're going to use the circuit of culture model throughout the semester, and we're going to incorporate it into a few of your assignments. So make sure you listen closely there. And finally, I'm going to give you some examples of what media consolidation is and how media convergence works. So let's begin. All right, first question, why do we study the media? All right, why are you taking this class other than maybe your advisor told you, hey, this is a class that will help you meet your requirements? We study the media to help become more critical consumers and become more engaged participants of media culture, and also, as it says at the top of the screen here, to increase media literacy. Now, don't worry, I don't just sit here and read all the lecture slides to you. I'm going to go into a lot of this stuff in detail and give you some examples, but I just want to start us off all in the right place here. Now, when I say media, a lot of people think that when we refer to the term media, we're only talking about news and information. You know, the media gets blamed for everything, it seems. Oh, the media did this, the media did that. But when we talk about media, we actually mean all sorts of products and artifacts that the different cultural industries produce, such as recorded music, books and magazines and comic books that you might have read. It does include news and information, but your favorite TV shows and movies and video games and your apps and other digital content. Also things that you might not have thought about. And we'll talk more about how media and culture have kind of a loose relationship when it comes to them being almost synonyms. Now, a media literate person, and that's what I really want you to focus on becoming as much as possible this semester. All right? I want you to be able to understand and really be able to explain what the influences are that make different organizations make decisions about what movies get released, who gets cast, who gets the job as the director, what intellectual property gets made into a video game and a Barbie doll and a Lego set and all that stuff? Why do we gravitate towards some intellectual properties and not others? We also want to be up to date on what political issues influence and are related to the media. All right, the media is a sector of our economy that used to be very heavily regulated. We had some huge, very important regulations that happened in the 1930s through the 1970s. But in the 1980s and 1990s and moving into the early 2000s, almost all of those regulations were stripped away by the very people that are now blaming the media for all of society's ills. So it's a tricky thing. On the one hand, we don't want regulation because as a country, both Democrats and Republicans have adopted this idea of a free market economy is the best option. But when we don't have regulation, then different operators in organizations and big companies make decisions that might impact consumers and society in a negative way. We want to examine how what we learn about society and ourselves comes from what we see in media. We want to think about what are the ethical aspects of decisions that content creators make. We want to know a little bit about how professors and scholars and authors research the media and how they might bring their own biases to that. And we're going to try to unpack that in a few ways. And we also want to be able to ultimately enjoy our media in a more sophisticated manner. The more you know about the content that you're consuming, ultimately, in most cases, the more fun it is. So our book uses the term mass communication. It also uses the term mass media. For a lot of reasons, the term mass has become sort of an outdated term. So colleges and universities are starting to slowly move towards the term media studies or the media industries. So I tend not to say mass comm that much because most of my training it has taught me to say media industries or media studies. But when I talk about that, I'm talking about all of the things you see listed here and more, even things like sports and fashion, in addition to film and TV and video games and books and radio. Now, the term mass communication, and I'm just giving you your textbook definition now, so it's not to confuse you. But what that means is the process of designing a cultural message or story and delivering that message or content to the largest possible audience, all right? We do this through a number of different media channels. And the era of mass communication goes back thousands of years. I want you to take a look at two short videos. If you haven't already done so, I have put them before this video, I believe, of an example of an early society where there's a tribal elder telling the story. It's a scene from Moana. And she's talking about the history of her people. I also am showing a clip that's not spoilery, I promise, from Game of Thrones to show how the wonder of having access to the world's knowledge the first time you're allowed to go to a library. All right? That's old Sam, if you know Game of Thrones, the first time he gets to go to the library. Now, some people say that oral tradition is more honest and true. Some people say that the written tradition is more concrete. But there is debate about that because the people who had access to written language were usually people who had more money and more power. So it was their version of the stories that got told and passed down. Whereas the oral tradition, stories might change over time or from village to village, but they're told by everyday people, not necessarily the people who are power who are trying to get a dominant message out to the people that they rule over. Now, I'm sure y'all have heard of the Gutenberg Bible and the printing press, and we kind of think about it as the beginning of printed communication starting in the late 1400s, early 1500s, but that is actually quite incorrect because it only accounts for Western European civilization. Non-white, non-European civilizations have been mass printing religious texts and government texts for thousands and thousands of years. The earliest known one goes back to, I believe, what would be current day Iraq. uncovered clay tablets that were used to print mass copies of religious texts. The first known movable type dates back to 1000 CE, or sometimes you might know it as 1041 AD. The AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, we've replaced that with CE, which means Common Era. It's a more secular historical reference of time. Bi Sheng was a commoner who was the person who developed movable type. He did it in wood and porcelain, which made it very fragile and delicate. Gutenberg's contribution, I will show you more about in a moment. I believe I included a video clip for you of that as well. Yes, here we go. So Gutenberg's contributions was that it was metal type, and it was very easy to make as many letters as you needed to. He also brought in the concept of page numbers, and he commercialized movable type because he used an old wine press. So the technology was pretty easy to kind of reverse engineer or kind of do a DIY home version of building a printing press. Any local merchant could probably build a printing press and keep one in the back of his shop. So it really brought in mass production of written work and knowledge. It accounted for transferring knowledge and helping scientists find each other, and it helped usher in the age of science and reason. Books came a couple hundred years after that, and books were the first mass-produced product in the history of humankind. The print revolution ushered in literacy, and we really have this idea of democratized knowledge. On the one hand, if you have access to a Twitter account, you can say anything you want to say with a very few exceptions, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks. And on the one hand, that means that you can get your message out just as quickly and easily as anybody, right? Our book gives the example of survivors of the Parkland tragic school shooting. Those survivors had more Twitter followers than the NRA when those survivors were speaking out in favor of reasonable gun control. So they had twice as many followers than the National Rifle Association and were able to get their message out. Now, that does have its limitations, and I think our book goes into that as well. But I want you to think about, on the one hand, we can say anything we want. On the other hand, does that only help us, or does that cause problems too? That's a question that I'll invite you to grapple with as you move through this semester. It's not an easy answer, and there's not one right answer to that one. Later in the semester, we're going to go through the electronic age in detail, starting with wireless technology, not Wi-Fi, but early radio technology. We're going to talk about the film industry, radio, and then now new audio forms of communication like podcasting and things like that, and also television and streaming content. We're going to talk a lot about that in the weeks ahead as well. And then we are going to talk about digital communication, because that's kind of where we are at this moment. You are taking a college course online. We would not have been able to do this in this format as recent as 10 years ago. All right, that is all for this first video. Move on to the second video.